All right, so we have here the owl head with safety eyes. It is stuffed, and if you wanted to leave it just like this and not thread sculpt, that's totally fine. But I wanted to show you kind of taking things one step further, what you could do with thread sculpting. So this is a 5-inch doll needle. It helps you go all the way through the head for thread sculpting, which is basically just going back and forth, connecting 2 points and kind of tightening them in as you go. It just adds kind of more definition and depth to the face. I'm going to start from underneath with this one because of the safety eyes already in place. I do have that cross stitch plastic here, but like I said before, the needle just goes right through it, so it's not something you really have to fight. So I like to go diagonal, so from this point up to this eye. And the body is not yet stuffed. There is some cross stitch plastic in place, so it's a little stiff, but you can still fold it under. So I've gone from this under the neck. You can see my little cat friends over there. Up to the inside point of the eye. We'll pull that through. And you'll go back in roughly the same place. Kind of just barely underneath the eye, that inside point, down to that same point underneath the neck where we started. I meant to tie a knot from that first point, but forgot that step. So when you are thread sculpting, I recommend that you do tie a knot there. As you can see, it's already kind of sinking in a little bit because I'm just pulling that thread tight. I'll go back from that point underneath the neck, up to the inside of the eye again. Nope. Sometimes it takes a little trial and error to get it out, and there is that plastic eye in the way, so it's going to be just a little bit of kind of finagling to get it in place. And we'll go back under, inside the eye, diagonally through the head, just to really nicely sink that eye into place. I just got a really big thread knot here. And that is kind of one of the hazards you run when you're doing thread sculpting. You need a really long thread to do this because it's not like a normal stitch. You're basically going to be leaving long thread trails inside of the head to connect. And then that 5-inch needle means that you actually need a really good length of thread left to tie a knot when you're done, which is why I'm risking getting those big thread knots just to have that extra length. So this is my last one I'm going to do. I recommend going back and forth about 3 or 4 times. And then go back in and through. As you see, this cross stitch fabric is not a problem. It just, needle goes right through it, which is why I recommend using that as opposed to cardboard or a different kind of plastic or other stiffening agent. I would say there is a heavy duty iron-on interfacing that you use for example for like hat brims. That might work. I have not tried it, but if you would like to, you are more than welcome to. I'd love to know how that works for you. I do think it might be a little more difficult to stitch through than this, but I do think it would also work pretty well. So I've tied a knot here, and then I'll just kind of bury the thread by going through. Because I'm using a faux fur, it's not as big of a deal. Apparently I didn't bring my scissors, so I'll leave that loose for now, but I will eventually tie it. And the difference here, as you can see, from the side especially, this eye is really sunken in, it has some shape and definition. This one's still sitting on the surface, which still looks really cool, but we're going to do that same thing and just sink that eye in as well. So I have a second needle threaded, another doll needle, 5-inch. And again, we'll go diagonally, so we'll start from this point over here up into the eye. And this time I will remember to tie a knot to get it started, just to give a little more stability to that point where we're first really adding some stress from thread sculpting. The reason you go back and forth a couple of times is because eventually it will kind of just hold on its own. It's not really putting a bunch of stress on any particular stitch or any particular joint. It's just kind of going to hold pretty well on its own. If you decide you don't like the thread sculpting look though, all you need to do is cut the stitches underneath here and kind of just work on it, and it should come loose. and come right back up. So I'm going back in the inside of this eye, just like we did on the other side. We'll go diagonally through the head. And like I said before, sometimes it's a little bit of finagling to get it back to the point you want it at. And we'll go back up. I actually am really liking the look of these safety eyes. I think this might be my preferred method for these owls, but if you're just getting started with thread sculpting, I think it would be easier to do and recommended to do kind of just an applique eye, because with that, you're not working around a big plastic piece. You are just doing the thread sculpting before you add the eye. If you look at my other video, I kind of walk you through that process. But if you've done thread sculpting a little bit, or you're kind of comfortable working around these extra hindrances, this is a really, really nice way to go. And if you decide that you would like to not do a joint and just stitch the head directly onto the body, you also won't have this body piece to work around. You will just thread sculpt the eyes once you complete and stitch the head closed. So that is kind of the eyes section. And I'll tie that off. The next thing we're going to do is go along the blue lines that I marked. I used a water-soluble marker, so that means once I spray it with water, those marks will disappear. If you're going to use this with your fabric, I highly recommend you try a swatch before you draw on your actual plushie, because sometimes things happen, the fabrics react weirdly, and it doesn't disappear. So the next section I'm going to do is thread sculpting this into more of a beak. And this one, I just use a normal hand sewing needle. I recommend using a thimble if you have one. Mine is currently missing, so I don't have one. I'm going to start here in this seam and kind of just take the needle up to this inside top part of my line and give it a little tug. The knot should pop through the seam and come up here to the top. So now you don't have to have a knot on the surface of your fabric. I am going to start by adding just some extra knotting to keep everything in place. And then you're gonna pinch these parts together. Make sure you have some stuffing in here, because what you're actually doing is kind of pinching this fabric and stuffing together to give you just some more of that beak shape. And for this top part, I recommend going back and forth 3 or 4 times, just right here on the top. You always want to go through the nose, never over. If you go over, it's going to add that line of thread. So you want to just go back and forth, kind of right in the same area that your needle came out. And once you've done that a few times, it'll hold pretty well on its own without you pinching it, but I recommend just kind of keep pinching it. Go down just a little ways from that first seam that you've made, and you'll just keep sculpting it. I recommend kind of going down to a point here for the beak, but if you would like to leave it more wide, that's fine. If you want to kind of experiment with the shape of this beak, that's totally fine as well. I based this design on a barn owl, kind of my base pattern, but I left it open enough that you could really experiment with some of the shapes and sizes and appliques and coloring to make a lot of different owls. So as you can see here, this is a snowy owl. But sometimes you may want a wider bridge or a shorter nose area, wider set eyes or closer together. It's really up to you. This is just kind of a place for you to get started. And I'm going back up a little bit, just reinforcing and tightening. But there's not really any stress on the thread at this point. It's just holding on its own. So I'm just gonna tie this off here. The next step is going to be to add a beak. You can either hand stitch applique the beak on, or you can just hot glue it. It will stay really well. It's just a single piece of stable fabric, so felt or fleece or suede, pleather, vinyl, kind of whatever is interesting to you. And it's just a triangle that kind of goes right there onto the face. And because you've sculpted it, it's going to stick out from the face really nicely. You don't have to do a really involved extra beak. So that is my snowy owl.